Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see so many people here on this really lovely day. My name's Lee Marsden. I'm head of the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies here at UEA. And it's my great pleasure to be introducing Professor Luna Filipovic. Luna specialises in experimental psycholinguistics and bilingualism, and in semantic and syntactic processing of typologically different languages, which is probably as hard as it is to pronounce. Her undergraduate studies were in English language, literature and linguistics at the University of Belgrade in Serbia, and she received her MPhil and a PhD in linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Prior to her appointment at UEA, she was an ESRC postdoctoral research fellow in psycholinguistics at University College London, and a Leverhulme Trust and Newton Trust postdoctoral research in forensic linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Luna's research examines the effects of language and the differences between languages on memory, verbalization, and the translation of witnesses' accounts of events. She's conducted experiments that show how a specific language spoken by a witness or suspect can affect the quantity and quality of information given. Such experiments reveal how, when, and why information can be distorted in translation, impacting on witness memory and the judgments made by juries. Luna's research has discovered some pertinent problems that non-native speakers and learners of English face in legal contexts when they're being interviewed via an interpreter or when speaking with inadequate English. Using extensive materials from different courtrooms and police stations in California and in England, she's found that linguistic habits and expressions can mean different things in different languages. This can lead to potentially significant differences in how events are described and interpreted. Luna's current research highlights the ways in which equality and access to justice can be negatively impacted as a result of the discrepancies between the original statements and their translations. Luna's also done extensive experimental work on the effects of languages and the effect they can have on witnesses, including the memories of bilingual speakers. She's authored, co-authored, or edited 6 books, with the 7th on the way, published numerous peer-reviewed articles and invited chapters, and given many invited and plenary talks around the world. Tonight, she's taking us on a linguistic journey into the mind. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Luna Filipovic to give her inaugural lecture.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you all for coming. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight. I was a little girl when I first discovered the power of language. My dad spoke many languages, and I was fascinated by how many doors it opened for him. He would speak to people in their native languages, and suddenly everything became possible, even things that were previously deemed impossible. My dad was an academic, and he was a university researcher in physical chemistry. And I thought I was going to follow his path. I love science, I was good at it, particularly chemistry. And everybody told me, oh, you can learn language as an add-on with your career. That's fine. You just go and do something else, but languages will come. But my fascination with language was much deeper and broader. So that fascination brought me here in front of you today. I was 11 when my dad got his PhD. I remember his viva distinctly, and I said, I want one of those PhDs, and I got it. My dad died, didn't see it happen, but I kept my promise. And that particular promise was kept thanks to my mom, who was my rock and support, and she still is to this day, helping me get on and make things happen for me professionally and personally. So thanks, Mum and Dad, first. And now I will talk to you about all things language, especially how languages relate to thinking, memory, and judgment. These are the crucial starting points that I want to open with tonight. Language and cognition have a special relationship. I know that term is loaded in some other contexts. It may be loaded here, we'll see by the end of the night. But it is a very special relationship. They are intimately intertwined. Language is part of human cognitive apparatus. Language and non-linguistic cognition are related. For example, our motor cortex is active when motion words are processed, even when there is no actual motion. Language can shape cognition. This means that habitual ways of talking about things may foster preferred ways of thinking about them. For example, if your language obliges you to distinguish between two different shades of blue, you're more likely to talk and think about them as two different colors. Language provides crucial insights into the human mind. We cannot see or hear our thoughts, but we can speak about them. Also, when something unusual happens, we can detect it based on language. For example, in situations where we're assessing autism or stroke consequences. There are some controversies in language and cognition research. It's very exciting to be in this field in this day. One of them, I want to highlight a few for you here. One is how similar or different are language and other cognitive functions? Are the same kind of processes underlying these two things, these two entities? Is language a separate module, very different and independent from other parts of the human cognitive apparatus? Then, following that, is the mind modular? Certain functions in our brains are highly localized. Certain processes, including language, seem to happen mainly in certain parts of the brain, but not in others. So that can lead us to believe that those are specialized functions or modules in specialized areas of the brain. And then, how similar is our mind to a computer? We are computing, but is that the same kind of computing that computers do? Some linguistic traditions in the past have put emphasis on the mind as a machine idea, focusing on computational aspects of language and on differences between language and cognition. Some more recent traditions in linguistics, such as cognitive linguistics and psychology, view language as a socio-cognitive construct, and they emphasize many similarities between language and other cognitive processes. So there are some processes which seem to underlie both language and other cognition aspects. For example, general purpose processes that provide foundation for category induction, which means that you see a few examples and then you derive a category from it. We do that in language, but we do that out of language as well. Also pattern completion, which is when you see a pattern and you know what's coming. So that happens in language, but that happens also in other cognitive tasks. If you ever had an intelligence test, this is what you're asked to do. So it seems to be that there is some kind of separatedness between language and cognition, but there also seem to be some similarities, and there certainly is overlap. Now, why language is not only about computation? So I decided to put this cartoon here by my favorite cartoonist, Gary Larson, and I hope you find it funny. Computers don't. Well, another blonde hair conducting a little more research with that Jane Goodall tramp. So I'm glad you are smiling or laughing, and that shows us how much knowledge goes into the interpretation of this joke. You need to know not just to process the meaning of the words, you need the world knowledge to know what's implied here, what kind of research can lead to the exchange of hairs, in this kind of blonde hair. So this is something that tells us that language is much more than computation. It is computation, but there's much more to it. Now, language and cognition in unison is something that excites me, and this is something to ponder for us tonight. How inseparable are language and cognition? If language and cognition are very independent of each other, and language has to be acquired as an independent, specialized module that has nothing to do with the rest of our perception, memory, etc., then why is it so hard to separate them, language and the other cognitive functions? We do that in the lab, but this does not reflect the reality. In real life, language is intricately bound to other aspects of our cognitive lives. And even though we run experiments that impede the use of language in an artificial way, this is not what billions of humans do every day. There are some cases, however, where we can detect substantial degrees of separation between language and cognition, the rest of cognition. There is language development without cognitive development, and we know that on autism spectrum. I'll give you an example in a moment. And there's also cognitive development without appropriate parallel language development, which are cases of language deprivation in childhood. So we have situations where speakers developed really high level of language use, but cognitively they're severely impaired. So in some cases, you have speakers who talk about going to a bank, opening an account, drawing money out, but they have the mental age of 5. They don't know what a bank is, yet they speak about it. So there seems to be a dissociation between linguistic use and cognitive processing. On the other hand, we have situations where language deprivation of children who have not been exposed to language at a certain age, they grow up, the cognitive development is there, but the language use is not. And they never achieve what I call here language and cognition symphony. It's never realized in those cases, but these are exceptions. So what's this language and thought? Is there a language and language of thought? What does it sound like? That's very much a scientific question, as a philosophical question. And many disciplines have tried to answer this question, language of thought. What is it? What does it look like? Well, this is one example of what it may look like.
Oh, no! Put me back in! Put me back in, please! Buddy, let go of my head and put me back inside. Oh! Who is that? Who's that? Who are you? Oh, no! Oh, lady, I'm freezing. I'm so cold. I'm so cold. Lady, hey, now listen. Listen. Let's be reasonable. Hey, get that thing away from me. Wait a minute. What are you going to do with that? Don't give that to him. Hey, wait a minute. Let's talk about that. Ow! I need that!
Okay, so Hollywood wants us to believe that the language of thought is English, clearly, right? This is how we think. But actually, it's much more intriguing and exciting than that. I believe that it's a multi-semiotic system derived from multi-sensory experiences. But until translated into natural language, it does not do much for us. Using language to formulate and share thoughts is the greatest advantage humans have. So how can we not be fascinated and not want to know everything about it? My position on language cognition, in very brief terms here, is that I'm with Vygotsky on this, a Russian scientist who unfortunately died young, didn't manage to develop his theories. And I do believe that language and thought start their developmental journey in parallel. But at one point, they intersect, and thought becomes linguistic, and language becomes fully cognized. And that is nothing short of magical. My research program aims to answer these specific questions about language and other cognitive functions, language and thought. These are some of the questions I tried to answer. And some of them I have answered, so I will show you that tonight. What are the effects of language on cognition, memory and judgment in particular? Specifically, do people tend to describe the same events differently because their language makes some things easier and some things more difficult to express? Do we remember event details better because our language obliges us to verbalize these details all the time, in comparison to speakers of another language, which does not oblige them to express these details? And finally, can different languages sway judgments differently in relation to witnessed events? How do I do my research? I use language typology, which is basically grammars and lexicons across different languages. And these are some of the languages I looked at: English, Spanish, Italian, French, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Serbian, Mandarin, Chinese, and modern Greek. I also look at monolingual and bilingual electronic databases. These are corpora, electronic corpora, that we can search for authentic examples of language use. So we don't have to invent examples, we have examples of actual use to check our hypotheses on. Psycholinguistic experimental methodology is something I use on a daily basis. This is my main area of work these days, and these are experiments on recognition and recall memory and translation experiments. This is an overall interdisciplinary approach, and it crosses the boundaries of linguistics, psychology, sociology, forensic science, and communication science. So I would like to introduce you to this notion of thinking for speaking. And the idea behind it is that the words and rules of our language direct us to focus more readily on those aspects of reality that our language requires us to express. This idea was put forward by Dan Slobin from Berkeley. Different languages make different things obligatory to say. That is a fact. For example, if you're a speaker of Turkish, you have to specify whether you're saying something that you witnessed firsthand or something that you did not witness yourself but got from other sources, which is so-called second-hand information. Right? So imagine that you're speaking in English and you're starting every sentence of yours, if you didn't witness it yourself, with "it seems that" or "apparently." When you want to tell somebody what you heard on the news, for example. So the other day I had this, apparently somebody in Oxford took a photo of a single atom. And that's really a true example. It did happen. There's a beautiful photo of a single atom. You read this online, but you have to specify that you didn't witness it firsthand. Or, "it seems that it's raining in Norfolk." You just heard this one on the BBC World Weather Forecast while sunbathing in Mallorca. So the normal thing would be to say, "Oh, it's raining in Norfolk, right?" But no, you have to specify, "it seems like," or "apparently," or "it looks like," every time you report something that you heard, someone that you didn't witness firsthand. There are different ways to think for speaking. And I'll show you this example here. And this is what typology does for us. It shows us how different languages refer to the same events. So, she ran into the park. Simple sentence in English. In Spanish, it is entró en el parque corriendo, which means entered the park running. He or she is not specified, could be anything, third person, because you don't need to say that. You can infer it from context. You can drop the pronoun. And these are the so-called Prodrop languages. Spanish. In French, you have to say, elle est entrée dans le parc en courant. She entered the park running. So similar pattern to Spanish, just the pronoun is there. In Serbian, you have to say utrčala je u park, which means ran into park. In that way, you have a prefix on the verb, this thing in front of the verb, which gives you direction of motion. And then in Chinese, if you look at the example, she ran into park, 她跑进了公园. She run enter park. So you can see that Chinese, English, and Serbian have a similar pattern. They will talk about running into, whereas Spanish and French talk about enter running. Okay? And notice that in Spanish and French, because running is not obligatory to say, gerund we can dispense with. We can't live without verbs. We can sort of live without gerunds. I hope there's no gerund army here to come at me afterwards. But if something is obligatory in language, it must be there in order to have a sentence. So verbs must be there. The reason why these differences are like that, it's a long story, and there is another talk brewing inside me on this topic only. But basically the prepositions in Spanish, French, Greek, Turkish, they don't signal this change of direction, they signal location rather. So they have to express change of location in the verb. And if the verb position is occupied for direction, you have to put manner elsewhere in a gerund. And if it's in a gerund, it's likely to be omitted. So I wanted to see whether these differences between languages have any effect on cognition. I first showed different videos, we'll see an example of this, to speakers of English. And these are the expressions, the verbs they gave me describing the videos I showed them. I don't know what half of these means. I hope the English native speakers or better English speakers than me would know. But there are 24 types of manner verbs given by English speakers to describe the videos that I've shown them. And these are walk, run, jump, limp, sway, march, lollop, leap, shuffle, sway, stride, bop, scamper, hop, creep, swagger, sling, stomp, bounce, strut, skip, saunter, pace, sidestep. Oh, breathtaking, right? And then these are the expressions that these sort of mock witness experiments provided for me. He leapt out and marched across the road. He limped, then swayed across the path. He emerged behind a tree, smoothly walked along the path, then skipped off. Okay? Very good witnesses here, but English makes it easier for them, you see? But witness descriptions in Spanish, very interesting. There's only a few verbs, and these are their descriptions. Exited slowly walking, walk with small jumps, cross the garden going strangely, exited enclosure being silly, that's my favorite one. So, you see, you're trying to describe, but you don't have the resources here like you have in English, and as a result, I wanted to see, is there a difference in memory task? So if your language makes it easy and abundant for you to say something, will this help your memory? It's very controversial. Language and memory is a greatly controversial topic. And we know it's controversial but true that language affects memory. And we know that, you know, the seminal study in psychologists from Loftus and Palmer in 1974, where they show the different words used in asking witnesses certain questions elicited different kinds of responses about what they witnessed. Even more controversial, but also true, is something that I do, which is the particular language can affect memory in a language-specific way. That is often called the Sapir and Whorf tradition, if you're familiar with that work, but neither Sapir nor Whorf, who were a famous anthropologist and his student, actually formulated this hypothesis. This was formulated after they both died, and they probably turned in their graves to see what became of their interesting work. That tradition was sidelined because people interpreted it, oh, languages limit our world, and we have to think as languages dictate. Nothing of the sort was said by either Sapir or Whorf. There were certain indications that languages affect how we would focus or what we would normally home in on, but nothing like languages imprisoning us. So that was this severely strict version was completely wrong, and as I said, wasn't formulated by them. This idea was welcomed again in neo-Whorfian research on color, object classification, and spatial relations that showed language effect on cognition. So the exciting thing is to know when, how, or why we have this interaction where language impacts cognition. We know it's there, but the exciting bit is where do we have it and when we don't have it. So these are the kind of videos I show in the lab. Okay. There's this one. Okay. Did you notice the difference in motion? Yeah, that's very good. And the interesting thing is that when you're in the lab and you have a lot of these, you're not 100% successful as tonight. This is just the little shot of what happens in the lab. This is another one. And another one with a slight difference. Did you notice a difference there? More or less, yes or no? No, you see? Well, if you're a speaker of English, you're more likely to notice these differences because you can label, there are 3 different motions in each video, and you're more likely to label them as distinct things. And then you say, ah, yeah, I remember, there were 3 different types and there's 2 in the other video, so yeah, it's different. And recognition errors, recognition is an experimental technique in psychology where I show you one video and there I show you another one and I say, did you see this first one? Did you see the video? Sorry, is it the same? Did you see this before? And you say yes or no. Okay, this is the kind of recognition memory task in brief. And then the recognition memory was better for Spanish speakers. These are errors. It was worse for Spanish speakers because we have the error rates here. This is the graph with error rates. So if you speak Spanish, you have more errors in recognition and you say, yes, I saw this before, whereas it's not the same in the second half of the experiment. If you're a speaker of English, you have fewer errors because you label them better in the first time around. What does this mean? Well, if you're speaking English, you're more likely to describe the manner of motion in more detail and remember it better than speakers of those languages that do not have many manner verbs and that do not express manners easily or often in their sentences. But let's see now what happens when English does not give us the relevant categories to distinguish between events when another language, Spanish, does. So each of the languages that I looked at has something going for it, something they're better at. Huh? So now we see where Spanish is better, much better. So accidental or not, some languages have different constructions to signal consistently whether something was on purpose or not. So English is not one of those languages. Spanish is. So it's not obligatory in English to say whether something happened on purpose or not. So you can say, he dropped the bag. Was that on purpose or not? I mean, we can vote quickly. Do you think it was on purpose if I say he dropped the bag? Yes? No? No? It's very divided. We don't know. The answer is we don't know. Could be either way. Because verbs in English don't specialize for agentivity. We don't know. Simply. That's the correct answer. We can't tell. If you're speaking Spanish, you will use different constructions for that. And usually different verbs. Sometimes the verb is the same in the construction, but it's clearly razor sharp clear. If it's on purpose, you would say, se le cayó el bolso, meaning she dropped the bag accidentally. To her, to him, the bag fell, which means not on purpose. If you are saying that it was on purpose, you would say botó el bolso, or tiró, or other verbs, right? But you will make that crystal clear for every scene you witness. Because you wouldn't use something as ambiguous as he dropped the bag. So English has a similar construction to indicate that something was an accident, where the speaker was somehow involved, because we want to say that the speaker was involved. The car died on me, but it's very limited. Like, I'm affected, right? But I'm not the agent. I didn't make it die. It died on me. It was not my lack of care that made it die. So it died on me. And then you can also say, the bag dropped, or the glass broke. But we still don't know what the agency was. Was it on purpose or not? Did somebody push it on purpose or not? Yeah, the glass broke, but who was it? So there is a potential to use the distinction in English between he broke the glass and the glass broke. However, there's no grammatical restriction whereby you can only say the glass broke if it's an accident. There's many people, oh, you know, he was sitting at the table and then he pushed the glass fell and it broke. It's on purpose, could be, angrily. I pushed the glass and it broke. So it broke does not imply lack of agency. In Spanish, perfect. And more importantly, people call this the genius of Spanish language, this construction. affective dative construction. It is very common, and it is very frequent. So this is what the kind of videos we look there.
Not for sex, for convenience. You can't deny that by comparison, our internal function is extremely high maintenance.
Okay, that was one.
Now,
My daughter is the actress here. Coding of events in English and Spanish. So the coding of events in English was predictably ambiguous. Speakers used things like the woman knocked the bottle off the table for both intentional and non-intentional acts. Similarly, the girl popped the balloon could be in both cases. The girl popped the balloon. Or the balloon popped for both. Oh, the girl pierced the balloon and the balloon popped. The constructions are used interchangeably in English. There is a not strict distinction. Like in Spanish, we do have strict distinctions. So in the first case, we know this was an accident because all of my speakers, 100% responses, were unanimous. To her, the bottle fell. It's clear that it was an accident. The second one, the girl broke the balloon. It's clear that it was on purpose. So you understand these things from Spanish, in this case, mock witness testimony. And experiments I did on memory show that the total recognition errors are higher for English than for Spanish. And these are statistically significant errors. So Spanish speakers remember better whether something was done on purpose or not. Now, the big thrill, and this is what my most recent work and my upcoming book is about, it's the bilingual advantage. And I will not be able to tell you everything, not because I want you to get the book. I was not told to say that, but just because we will run out of time and I would like to hear some questions and exchanges with you, have exchanges. So in brief, bilinguals seem to be efficient and use one pattern whenever they possibly can, instead of constantly switching between the two patterns. Many people have noticed this before, but so far we haven't had a model of bilingualism that captures that. And this is what we try to do in this paper, which is just coming out any moment now. So the bilinguals, they maximize common ground. How do they do that? Well, they do a variety of smart things, which may make them sound not so authentic at times, but they are benefiting from heightened sensitivity to concepts they learned in both languages. And they want to be able to express all the meanings, distinctions in both their languages, and this helps their memory in both languages. So this is for bilinguals who are really proficient in both languages and are using both languages. So not the cases, we have cases where one language deteriorates through attrition, so you have bilinguals who come live in one country and forget about their heritage language, or we have second language learners where this is unbalanced proficiency. So one language is not as good as the other, but all of those speakers are trying to make common ground. Just that the balanced ones are doing it really good. They're not making grammatical errors, whereas second language learners or heritage speakers are also trying to make common ground as much as possible. It's much more efficient if you can use one thing in two different circumstances when you speak one language or the other. Be prepared for both languages, whichever comes your way. They maximize common ground. These are the experimental responses in the bilingualism experiments I had. So bilinguals tend to provide explicit details, even in languages that don't oblige them to do so. So I show the videos similar to the ones you saw to bilingual speakers. And I speak to them, for example, in Spanish throughout the experiment. And then I ask them to tell me what they saw, but in English, which means I keep their languages active at the same time. Both. There's a tension. And then what they do is they say, the man dropped the bag accidentally, by accident. In English. They don't have to, but they will if they have Spanish as the other language. Or they will say something, the bag fell out of man's hands. It doesn't sound perfect English, right? It's not so perfect. It's okay, but it's not, the man dropped the bags, maybe more elegant. I don't know. But the bag fell out of man's hands, yeah, okay, but it's accident. more likely than on purpose. So they try, because they know from Spanish, oh, I got to make that distinction. I got to have that distinction ready. I'm not sure which language is going to have to come out, so I better have it ready just in case. And that's a very good thing. It's good for the mind, and I'll tell you in a moment, you age less if you speak more languages. I'm not just selling our language courses here, though that may come later as well, subtly. Turkish-English bilinguals overuse constructions like it seems or it looks like, apparently, for information they did not witness themselves. So I'm talking about Turkish-English bilinguals who really do speak both languages fluently, or people who are like Dan Slobin, who mentioned it to me when he comes back from Turkey. He keeps doing that in English, because otherwise, he said, I would feel like a fraud to tell you something I didn't see myself. You would think I witnessed it, but I didn't. So I have to say that even in English. So you don't say the weather is going to improve unless you work for the National Weather Service, though I'm not sure they could say that. I mean, that's also tricky and also not always true and not always backed up by witnessed evidence. But there you go. You cannot ever say that the weather's going to improve if you have not witnessed it yourself. In Turkish and English, we can. So what about judgment made in response to utterances? How much can one's judgment be affected? So far I showed you how differences in languages can affect memory in monolingual and bilingual situations. But how much judgment, how much of our judgment can be affected? Well, sometimes too much. And this is probably my most famous case, which I wish I had never discovered. I worked on bilingual transcripts that were anonymized, so I don't know what happened to this person. But there was a speaker who was saying in Spanish, yes, to me it happened that she fell on the stairs. He had the biggest charge about to be laid on him, which is murder. There was no forensic evidence to say whether this was manslaughter or murder, but in some places in the world where we still have capital punishment, this is a big difference. Not just about understanding what would happen, but for a person's life. So the person says to me it happened that she fell on the stairs. She was carrying her. The translator says, oh yes, I dropped her on the stairs. And the police officer says, oh, we can go home, we have a confession. It's done, okay? And this was in the state of California, right? And as I said, I don't know what happened. It's a galling example, but I could not tell you about this because it's the most harrowing case I worked on. Why does it all matter? Well, it can affect decision-making of legal consequence, and this is what colleagues Caitlin Fawzi and Lara Borditsky shown. I don't know if you're familiar with the Super Bowl. It's a very American thing, but apparently there is this American football end of the league year match, and then there's always a famous superstar performing. And that one year, it was Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake, and there was this wardrobe malfunction where he pulled something off her, and something of her was exposed as a result. And this was really major because it happened before the watershed, before 9 o'clock, everybody's watching with the family, and suddenly you have this exposed bit of Janet Jackson. And researchers have found out that if this event was described as he tore the bodice versus the bodice tore, people would tend to have different judgment about how much punishment should be imposed. So it's more blame and 53% higher fine if they read he tore the bodice. They all saw the same thing. They just read different descriptions of it, right? And if they read the bodice was tore, the experimental participants, there was less charge. And it was less severe because it was kind of accident, was not on purpose. So, I would like to put this in front of you, that why it really matters, and I would like to promote this blog by Rudy Mendoza-Denton, who talks about not just language, but other things. And this is a very good source, the Psychology of Today blog. When we are in a rush, multitasking, or being cognitively busy, we're most likely to rely on stereotypes. Stereotypes are very dangerous, but this is an automatic reaction that we have. And I will add here, this includes linguistic stereotypes, the habitual patterns that we use more frequently to express things, to refer to things. And when we are witnessing a crime, this is precisely when we rely on stereotypes of all sorts. We need to interpret situations really fast. What we can conclude, English speakers may remember clearly how something moved, but Spanish speakers remember better if something was done accidentally or not. Crucially, language appears to be a relevant prop for this. And while not all memory is linguistic, but memories can be stored and evoked in line with language patterns. Language is the best storage system we have. So future research avenues, many more language and thought investigations involving more languages and other cognitive domains. That would be really exciting to see. Then another thing where I would like to work more, and I am working more at the moment, is informing policy to ensure equality in access to justice around the world, regardless of language spoken, especially for non-native speakers. And then promote and encourage language learning and bilingualism as an advantage in life. And there's really scientific research to back this up. If you want to be cognitively nimble, learn a language. I believe it's better than Sudoku. Nobody has ever actually tested this experimentally, but learning another language, especially the one with a different script like Chinese or Arabic, I think it's a very, very good thing. Regardless of what research is saying, there is a mixed research out there of benefits of bilingualism, multilingualism on cognitive function, on executive function more specifically. But what I think most could agree is that there are benefits on aging. And because we know that, for example, things like Alzheimer's are discovered more than 4 years later in bilingual populations, where all the other factors are controlled for, regardless of education, regardless of all the other numerous aspects. So promoting bilingualism is very much on my agenda. And to confirm that, it must be nice to be bilingual. You can talk to your enemy, arch enemy. Okay. Thank you very much. Can I just have a few words of thanks? As well, yeah? Is that okay? Just a few, yeah. I wanted to say special thanks in chronological order of our first encounter, people who have influenced me dramatically. Ranko Bugarski at the University of Belgrade, Peter Matthews, University of Cambridge, Dan Slobin, University of California at Berkeley, and Jack Hawkins, University of California at Davis. And these are the generous sponsors of my research: the ESRC, the Liverhume Trust, Newton Trust in Cambridge, and the Spanish Ministry of Economy and Competitiveness. And I have a huge list. This is never a one man or a one woman or one person, actually, show. There's a lot of people who helped me be here, and I have far too many people to thank, but I need to keep it brief. I would like to thank my fabulous family in Serbia and Italy, and my big daughter, Lucrezia, and my baby daughter, Aria, who always make sure I don't forget how important playtime is. And if I forget, they remind me, and they remind me that work cannot eat into playtime, which people tend to forget, even the best of us. If you're passionate about what you do, you kind of want to squeeze it into your day more and more. So I have them to keep me in check, and I'm really grateful. My friends in Serbia and England, and also all around the world, Spain, Singapore, China, the United States. I have to mention my best friend Maria, who transcends all categories of friendship, and I cannot imagine my life without her. And last but not least, my colleagues at UEA. It's a privilege, pleasure, joy to work with you. It's something really special when you have colleagues you get along with, you have fun with, that inspire you, and they're there to support you. So I'm really grateful for this experience, and thank you, UEA, wonderful place to be. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Luna. That was a terrific talk. And Luna really is an inspirational colleague, both to the students and also to colleagues across the school. And I think you've got a bit of a flavour of that tonight, as she's shared with her research and her passion for her subject. She began by talking about sort of fascination with language, and I think we've sort of caught that this evening. I was struck by the statement that she made right at the beginning. Using language to formulate and share thought is the greatest gift we have. And I think, you know, it's a gift for sharing, and you've certainly been able to share that with us tonight. And just as we watch those videos, you know, they're quite funny, quite amusing, and really interesting stuff, but really deadly serious if you're on the wrong end of a mistranslation. And it can mean, as we saw, you know, possibly a life sentence. And so the work that Luna's engaged in at the moment, it's fantastic in encouraging students and colleagues to engage in the research that she's involved in. But these are really life-changing, sort of events that she's engaged in. And so we are very privileged, I think, within the school to have Luna with us. We've now got about sort of 12 minutes or so when Luna's going to be able to take some questions. So the acoustics are pretty good in here, so we haven't got a roving mic, but if you shout out your question, Luna will answer it.
Thank you.
Begin.
Yes, I think earlier in your talk you referred to some work perhaps you've done, some research you've done in this area with people with in the autism spectrum. I wonder if you could just sort of very briefly say what that is and what you found.
Thank you. I haven't done research myself, but obviously throughout my education, which was both linguistics and psychology, I looked at the role of language in those various disorders, and I worked with people on other matters who themselves worked on stroke, for example. And it is quite interesting about when something goes wrong, we don't have a lot of way in medically except language. So the cases I mentioned, and that was really fascination of many linguists in quite a while ago, and they use this words like wolf children, which I don't particularly like or use, but this is basically the children with severe neglect who do have some cognitive development, but they never reach what they would have reached had the language been in. So these arguments and these examples are used to highlight the dissociation between language and cognition. So there are some dissociation issues there. Similarly, quite a few autistic people who are highly functional. We are all aware of that. But for these examples that I selected, it was to just say the difference between, you know, when language is developed, but the rest of the cognition isn't. And it really did fascinate me how these speakers could, I remember reading about these cases during my studies, how they have people speaking and you cannot say that they're autistic. There's no way of saying. But then when you ask them to do certain things, they don't have a concept, for example, of a bank. They don't know what a bank is. They wouldn't know how to go in and open an account. But they speak about it perfectly. They speak about having a boyfriend, going on a holiday. And they've never left the house. So this is something that I found quite fascinating, that dissociation. So this is what I wanted to just mention. But I haven't personally done research on autism. But if you are interested, I can point you to numerous studies that I'm familiar with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just on that, when you say language, do you mean productive language?
I mean, language is a system, language in your mind. It doesn't have to be... doesn't have to be spoken. It's the language that you have in your head, whether you're verbalizing it explicitly or not. That is relevant for some experiments that I do, but in principle I mean language as a system in the mind of the speaker.
It's just that I once taught a child whose mouth was completely dyspraxic, and she couldn't organise her mouth at all. She was a Portuguese speaker, but she didn't speak
Okay,
really hardly anything.
but she could use language.
No, she could understand Portuguese. I was there to teach her English.
Oh, how did you do that?
Yes, indeed. But it was about showing. It was about getting understanding, recognizing understanding without language.
That is, a language is
Because
both,
she was unable to form her mouth into the right.
it's both comprehension and production, of course, as we know.
Of course, she was in school for children with severe learning disabilities.
Yes.
So whether she had them or not, who knows?
Well, that was very difficult to assess because there was production was inhibited. Yes, very sad case. Yes, that's fine. Yeah. You want to take questions or me? Whoever?
If you're happy?
Yeah.
The concept is quite new to me, and I was kind of shocked by the example about the testimony for a crime, for instance. Is it already included in the teaching in translator schools or universities? Because that is a damn important thing to know when you study to become a translator, that certain languages have to take into account the way to express movement or intent in a
Thank you very much for this question. That's what we are trying to do here. That's why everybody should come and study translation here. The discipline of forensic linguistics that deals with these aspects of language is just now catching on some experimental evidence and language typology. And I think this knowledge should be spread, and we are trying to do this. I'm integrating this into all the courses and modules I teach. So yes, it is included in, but it's still very much, because forensic linguistics is a sort of niche discipline. It's not taught in many places, and we are familiar with it. And some psychologists are familiar, and some linguists are familiar, and some translation scholars are familiar. But because this is breaking boundaries among disciplines, it will take some time to kind of have the bigger spread. This is what we are hoping it will. And people who are, let's say, teaching translation have not thought about talking to linguists. This is a classical example of disciplines not talking to each other. So you teach translation, but you don't talk. Actually, what's the consequence of this language difference? So in English you say X, in Spanish you say Y. Is there any consequence for that? So the connections were not made, and this is why the exciting times now are for us who are making these connections, and we are teaching students here to do that. So thank you very much for this question and comment.
Hello, thank
Hello.
you for your talk. I think my question stems out of my personal interest and personal experience. So as a non-native English speaker, I had a moment, like a turning point in my life, when I realized that my language of thought has changed. So I started thinking and dreaming in English. So could you, have you done any research on this, and could you share some interesting facts of how this process happening and
Yes.
how it affects?
Very much so. So what was your previous language of thought? Russian. Okay. So very, very briefly, but yes, there is a lot of research going on second L2, what we call L2, language 2 speakers, or second language acquisition group. So what happens to speakers that move countries is that they speak their mother tongue and they learn their foreign language in school, like it happened to me. My first language is Serbian. I learned English and my other languages at school. And then you come to a different country and you start not using your mother tongue so much and using your new home language more. And people say you acquired language only when you start dreaming in it. It's a very romantic view, and it's not really true. You can dream in languages you don't speak so well. That's not that. That's not the case. However, what happens is that what is happening in your mind is that Russian is becoming your sort of heritage language, and this unbalanced situation is now leading you to feel a bit more comfortable with the language you use on a daily basis. So the habitual ways of thinking about things are in the language we use on a daily basis. So it's perfectly normal that if you don't speak Russian for days, that you will be doing all your processing in your second language. So this is something that happens to all of us. And when you go back to Russia, for example, you see that Russian has changed, and they ask you, we don't speak like that. You know, there's something weird with the way you speak. But you, remember, you have benefits of two ways of looking at a situation. So even if you don't, as I mentioned, if you don't sound authentic, you are gaining a benefit of being able to communicate easily in two languages. And you will probably still to this day have some intrusions of Russian into your English. No matter how proficient you are, unless you acquired both languages, now this is a real thrill. We don't know when the door closes for simultaneous bilingualism. We just don't know. Some people, when you read literature in psychology or psycholinguistics, some people say, oh, I have early bilinguals up to age 12. I said, what? No. In my studies, they're up to age 8. And then some other study, no, age 5. After age 5, you can't be simultaneous bilingual. There's no agreement. And we don't want to admit, but we don't know. But we do know that at some point, whether it's 5 or 8 or 12, the door shuts. And you cannot be proficient in both languages. So that's what's going to happen. So Russian is going to be on the back burner. You can always go back to it. It will always be present in your head. You can't switch it off. And it was always going to be part of your English as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
No problem.
Could I have just two more questions?
Oh, two more questions?
But
Yes,
there
the
will
lady.
be
Yeah.
Just in relation to the last speaker, in Canada,
Uh-huh.
we have immersion schools,
Mhm.
and you can go at 6, 9, or 13.
Mhm.
So presumably the Canadians have done research to show that
Yep.
you can become bilingual. So
Mhm.
you would enter French speaking
Mhm.
in a year, you'd be expected to study all your subjects in French as well as
Mhm.
English.
It is. Mhm. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
But I'm just wondering if what you're saying is true. Those who enter at 13 are slightly disadvantaged because it's almost as if they're learning a second language.
They are learning a second language. Yes, they are learning a second language, and we know that. On the whole, the earlier the better. This is what I'm trying to do is to encourage even English-only families to have their children learn a language from birth, another language, watching a DVD in another language. That's just a start. It's a very good start for the young minds. We know that they're much more adaptable, especially with pronunciation. So if you don't start early, you can acquire languages beautifully later. I started at 11. And I think my English is almost perfect, but I will never be able to pronounce it absolutely perfectly unless I really try. Yes, there's always this element, and pronunciation suffers the most. So the cognitive development that goes with children as they grow up, that enables them to really, at 13, acquire languages much faster and better than adults. They still have this agility, the mental agility. So they will acquire languages, but not as good, and not their way of thinking in two languages is not the same. There's always one that has the upper hand if you start later. Okay, one more question? Lee, you decide.
God, I did see the hand there, the lady in the white cardigan.
You were talking about the cognition and language being separate things.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
at some point they will converge.
And I also thought there might be a link as well with the fact that sometimes children who are brought up in a household which is, for example, non-English speaker, are refusing to speak actually the language of the parents for a very long time. I was wondering whether there's a dissociation there or what might be.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, it's always an advantage to learn another language. Doesn't matter the age. It will always affect your cognition. Always. And we know that. Because language and cognition, as we said, they're separate things, but they join together and they overlap and they feed off each other. And if you learn another language, that feeds into your cognition, perception, memory, everything. So we know that part of your question is true. Second language also has big effect. Now, as for children who are not learning languages of their parents, shame on the parents. You have to be persistent. You have to insist and not give in. You have to not let your child know that you speak English. Once they discover that, yes, it's gone. That ship has sailed of having a perfectly bilingual child. Because, I mean, obviously it's very hard. I've faced that conundrum because it was very hard to live in England and maintain heritage languages. It takes a lot of effort. And some communities are more organized than others. So, for example, there is Japanese club, and then Japanese mothers are really kind of strict there, that I know at least. I'm not generalizing or stereotyping, just for the record. But they have to, Saturday, it has to be, we go to Japanese club, and there's nothing that can stop us. Whereas there are some other communities which are, oh God, Sunday club, oh God. I'm not going to do that. So that was me. So I had to do more work at home. But it's the parents that have to insist and insist. Once the schooling starts, it gets more difficult because homework, of course, you're not going to do maths in Ukrainian when you have to present concepts and things and labels that are here that the child needs to know. So it gets difficult with schooling, but it can be done. You just have to be really, really persistent and insist on speaking your homeland language at home.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Lena.
Thank you.